not recording this.
Not cheat on Fitbit.
He has a counter on his phone.
I will cheat and start to get the title of my talk, which is about genetics, geography.
Emil from the SERVIR Science Coordination Office. It's genetics, geography, and satellites from genes to space. And this is my son, in case you didn't know it. So
this is my mom.
of course. Emil, hurry, you got 2 seconds.
Oh! Good start. All right. So my name is Emil, and basically, if you guys know anything about me, you know that I'm from Belize in Central America, and I'm probably the only Belizean scientist currently in NASA. My talk's going to be about 2 topics which really fascinate me: genetics and satellite data, because everybody loves satellite data, right? And I want to talk about how they're actually related. So basically, as you guys know, one of the principal uses of satellite imagery is for land cover mapping, for monitoring, some of the things we've been talking about all the time. And basically, the very first SERVIR hub at Capitolac in Panama, one of the crowning achievements that we had was a 2010, okay, gotta skip that one. But basically, one of SERVIR's thematic areas is land cover land use and ecosystems, and at the landscape scale, data like Landsat, ecosystem visible, and they're at one end of the biodiversity spectrum, and genes are at the other, and they're actually related. So how? Guess I gotta go. Satellite data are viewed at different spectral responses to individual species, like in the NASA Hyperion data that we see over here over French Guiana, and ultimately those spectral responses, in terms of how the light's reflected, absorbed, emitted, and transmitted, is mostly species specific, and the differences in species are essentially genetic. And that's how biodiversity at a genetic level influences species whose composition influences landscapes, which we see in satellite data. In other words, from genes to space. So, why do I work on this? Well, in 2004, near the end of my master's studies at the University of Washington, I read a really interesting article about a promising, first of its kind NASA program which was going to provide Central American governments with satellite data. Does that sound familiar to you? And does that guy look kind of familiar? Well, all right, so 9 months later, SERVIR America was launched, and 11 months later, I was working there along with some of the familiar faces that you see here in the crowd, like Francisco, Eric, and Africa. But my fascination with satellite data actually predates SERVIR. So yeah. All right. So following that, and yeah. So, but before SERVIR, basically, there was this thing called the GLCF, and that's when I first saw images of Belize, and I fell completely in love with what I saw. I mean, couldn't you? I mean, when you look at it, it's like the imagery basically, appealed to this kind of OCD part of my brain, and was like, hey, I really want to understand what's going on there. And let's see. Basically in 2010, I was able to, working at SERVIR, I was able to take some of that same satellite data and produce basically what is still now, even though it's kind of outdated, basically it's now the national reference for Belize, which is a forest change cover study using data from 1980 through 2010, and yeah, it was really cool. But if we drill down even further into the imagery, and we're looking at these patterns, the green and pink, etc., what we're seeing isn't just about, trees, etc. It's also about people, and what do we have here in the crowd tonight? People. So again, if we drill down even deeper, we can actually say, not just map out, the tree communities, but we can actually map out the human communities, which we're seeing here. It's a map of, the relatedness of different communities in my native Belize, and this is something that I did kind of like a detour while my PhD advisors weren't watching. But yeah. And the same way that how we can, map things with, we can map continents, we can also map genes locations on chromosomes because of the Human Genome Project. And a few years ago, I was genotyped, and basically these are my results, and it was like really fascinating what I found out. So I'm roughly half West African, 3/8 European, and 1/8 Native American, which is kind of like I have almost like DNA from all of SERVIR's regions, and so genetically, I'm half West African, and I'm SERVIR's rascal for West Africa, which is like actually it's really typical for a Belizean, actually. And so, long story short, one of the other cool things is I actually have DNA from Clovis and from Anzik, which is this child which was found in northern Montana. He died 12,500 years ago, and I share some of his DNA. So my ancestors have been there a long time. Dan once said, remote sensing without validation is remote nonsense, and basically to validate this data, I went to Belize's archives and Mary Alpuche and Yobani Aguilar, two of the really helpful research officers there, let me put my hands on this almost 200-year-old document written by my grandfather's grandfather, William Taylor Cherrington, and it was surreal to be able to touch something that my ancestor wrote with his own handwriting, as you're seeing there, and I was able to also use that and partly reconstruct my family tree. What else? The other thing that I find surreal is this area here in central Belize called the Pequary Hills, and basically every time I drive by there, going between Belize City and Belmopan, I feel just compelled because something's speaking to me in the landscape saying, hey, something's here, take a picture of it. Long story short, from the records indicate that basically in the 1800s, 3 generations of my family, 3 generations of Cherringtons were woodcutters, and 200 years later, I did a PhD in forest ecology, which I kind of find ironic, forest ecology being a descendant of people who knew those woods and probably passed through it, and so yeah. But I just wanted to say, closing, that ultimately this is just my story. This is really our story. It's the story of the human family, and SERVIR is part of that bigger human family. We're all ultimately related, and I'd like to thank you all for your attention.
All right.
Thank you. Good night.